Welcome to another edition of George Washington Speaks. I'm Tom Saffold. The repeal of 3 of the 4 Townsend Acts took the steam out of colonist protests. 30 months went by with only the very lucrative tea tax in effect. But in May of 1773, everything changed for the better, or was it for the worse? See what happened when one company was granted special privileges in the tea trade with the colonies. Here's George Washington.
Shortly after the Boston Massacre, the Townshend Acts were repealed, except for, of course, the tea tax. Lord North's ministry insisted on keeping the tea tax for 2 very important reasons. First, the ministry wasn't about to give up the hefty tax revenues they collected on the nearly 1.2 million pounds of tea that the colonists consumed each year. But more crucial was that Britain was not going to remove the symbol of Parliament's power over the colonies. And as they intended, the repeal of 3 of the 4 acts took the wind out of the colonial boycott, and the colonies gradually ended their non-importation movement by October. To most of the colonists, the one remaining tax, the tea tax, was more of an irritation, and they preferred to get on with their lives than protest. Consequently, from 1770 to 1773, things calmed down, and the British tea was once again imported into the colonies in very significant amounts. And notably, Boston once again became the largest colonial importer of legal tea. However, in New York and Philadelphia, smugglers still dominated the markets. In January of 1770, King George III appointed Lord North to head Parliament. Lord North behaved cautiously over the first 2 years, but when he saw the opportunity, he began to gather support to push through a new and innovative tea act of his own. It was the Tea Act, May 10th of 1773. This act, for the first time, allowed a single company, the British East India Company, to export tea directly into the colonies without going through London and paying the heavy 25% British duty. This resulted in making their tea 25% cheaper than the other tea companies shipping tea into the colonies, a very great advantage to the company. The North Ministry felt that this would solve 2 troublesome problems they were dealing with at the same time. First, they reasoned that the colonists could have no possible objection to paying for tea that was priced lower than the smuggled tea, even though it included the hated 3 pence per pound duty enacted by the Townshend Acts in 1767. In that way, the government would be able to increase their substantial income from the tax. Secondly, the financially strapped East India Company would be saved from possible bankruptcy, which some of its members had invested in heavily. Nevertheless, because the tax legislation was passed by Parliament without colonial input and consent, the tea tax still irritated and irked many colonists. And yet, there was even a bigger issue the colonists did not fully recognize. The issue was that the act allowed the East India Company to have a virtual monopoly on the sale of tea in the colonies. That is, they would have no competitors with the same advantage as they had. They would be the only company to import in British tea directly into the colonies without stopping in London and paying the 25% British duty. And if that was not enough, the company would also be totally free to decide to whom they would sell their tea to, without any government interference. And that would allow them to choose certain favored colonial merchants to sell through. and those agreements would be at whatever terms the company determined was the best for them. They chose merchants, most likely loyalists, that agreed to sell their tea and charged the company only a 10% fee to sell their tea. Normally, the fee would have been as much as 40%. So you can see that the East India Company picked up another 30% in profits, while the colonial merchant forfeited 30% profit in order to do business with them. It was a great deal for the East India Company. And yet there was another economic factor to consider. Not only would the favored colonial merchants profit less, but those American merchants that were not chosen, most likely patriots, could not compete with the selected merchants. They would be forced to buy tea from the other wholesale companies bringing tea into the colonies, and their wholesale price would start at a price that was at least 25% higher than the East India Company's price. Without similar concessions from the British government, those companies would essentially be out of the tea business. In September and October, 7 ships carrying East India Company tea were sent to the colonies. 4 were bound for Boston, and 1 each for New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. In the ships were more than 2,000 chests containing nearly 600,000 pounds of tea. Initially, the cheaper tea did sound good to the colonists, but while the ships were en route to the colonies, news began to spread about the actual impact of the tea on the colonies. And as always, Sam Adams was skeptical of Parliament's good intentions of the cheaper tea. He was one of the first to sniff out what Parliament was really doing. He took up the slogan, "Taxation without representation is tyranny," once again, and was joined by prominent tea smuggler John Hancock. The Sons of Liberty began a campaign to raise awareness and to convince or force the chosen consignees to resign, in the same way that stamp distributors had been forced to resign in the 1765 Stamp Act crisis. In such cities as New York, tea agents resigned or canceled orders, and merchants refused their consignments. As a result of their efforts, tea smuggling in the colonies increased dramatically up and down the entire coast. And even when the price of the smuggled tea surpassed the price of tea from the East India Company, many colonies chose to buy the smuggled tea as a protest. The principle of self-governance, then, became the major motivation of the colonial opposition to the Tea Act, and not just the burden of higher taxes. Once again, the British ministry misjudged the colonial mind and the colonial commitment.
The colonists had expressed their complaints about British policies in many different ways. The issues surrounding imported tea became a symbol of the colonial struggle. And in the next edition, George Washington will describe an event in Boston that became a rallying point for the movement toward independence from Britain. We know it as the Boston Tea Party.